Welcome. Now, while we talk about vulnerabilities and vulnerability management and patching and patch management, and we talk about all of these topics, it's also important to understand what is an exploit. An exploit is a program or some code that takes advantage of a security hole, that is a vulnerability, in an application or system so that an attacker can use it for their benefit. So when they actually take advantage of that vulnerability with some software or some code and exploit it, we call it an exploit. So there are two types of exploit, a remote exploit and a local exploit. A remote exploit works over a network and exploits the security vulnerability without any prior access to the vulnerable system. And a remote exploit or a mobile exploit, we had talked about earlier that a user could be browsing on through the browser a website, and mobile exploit would be downloaded, and that would be a form of a remote exploit, and the user would not be required to take any action or even to click on anything other than simply browsing on the website. So that's a remote exploit. Then we have local exploit. So what's a local exploit? A local exploit requires prior access to the vulnerable system and usually increases the privileges of the person running the exploit past those granted by the system administrator. So there's a privilege escalation on the local exploit. So it takes over your system and there's a privilege escalation involved. And the reason for that is obviously because the attacker wants to carry out other activities which require that higher privilege. So what is an exploit database? Now, the exploit database, and this is maintained by an organization, and we'll just look at the slide. So the exploit database is a CVE. You see, now we see the term CVE, the Common Vulnerability Enumeration, which we talked about. So the exploit database is a CVE compliant archive of public exploits and corresponding vulnerable software developed for use by penetration testers and vulnerability researchers. Our aim, and this is the organization speaking here, our aim is to serve the most comprehensive collection of exploits gathered through direct submissions, mailing lists, as well as other public sources, and present them in a freely available and easy to navigate database. So this is, you will just look at the screenshot for this. The exploit database is a repository for exploits and proof of concepts rather than advisories, making it a valuable resource for those who need actionable data right away. They need the exploit information right away. So here a good question is that if you are gathering a database of exploits, isn't it going to be helpful for the attackers? And the answer is yes. But the advantage of collecting the exploits and the related vulnerabilities in a database is far outweighs the disadvantage. And the reason for that is that we have to organize the white hat ethical hackers and the security researchers and the security practitioners and implementers and those people who are trying to implement security. We also need to organize the information for them. So the advantage of organizing and sharing this information with the security protectors or the defenders far outweighs the disadvantage of information sharing with the actual attackers. Now, this is a screenshot of the exploit database, exploit-db.com, and this is the organization which collects the exploit database. And here we can see the date added. You can download the exploit, and it gives you information if it's the vulnerability, the title of the vulnerability, the platform, and the author of the exploit. So these are all the categories, and you can actually go to this website and have a look. This is a snapshot of the exploit code when you download it, and as you can see that this is simply software code, and if you scroll down, it's all code. It's nothing but code because the exploit is actually consisting of code. So what is a zero-day exploit? A zero-day vulnerability refers to a hole in software that is unknown to the vendor. This security hole is then exploited by hackers before the vendor becomes aware and hurries to fix fix it, and this exploit is called a zero-day attack. So once a vulnerability becomes known, it's no longer a zero-day attack and it's published. But a zero-day vulnerability refers to a vulnerability which is not yet known by the vendors and they have not yet published it. And such a zero-day vulnerability could be taken advantage of by attackers with a zero-day exploit. And that is very threatening for the security industry. And one of the issues related to this is that security vendors sometimes work with obscurity and they don't really release the patch immediately because they have to do their own assurance mechanisms. So they may know that a vulnerability exists, but they may not release the patch in a very timely manner. And the attackers actually may be aware of that vulnerability, and then they could exploit that vulnerability because that vulnerability exists widely and it has not been released as an advisory, as a bulletin, and people simply don't know that this vulnerability exists, and hence no effort has been taken by the security industry to patch it. So zero-day exploits and zero-day vulnerabilities are very critical. And there are specific ways and mechanisms how you can address zero-day vulnerabilities. That's all that we have for this module. Thank you.